The sky didn't just fall, it attacked. In the Wyoming territory of 1887, the wind came with teeth, and it wanted to chew the world down to the bone. Thomas Garrett felt it on his ridge, watching his small herd of cattle bunch up by the frozen creek. He was 24 years old, the sole owner of 300 acres of stubborn dirt and rock. And he'd learned a long time ago that the sky told truer stories than men ever did. And right now, the sky was screaming a warning. The light went thin and gray like dishwater. The birds just vanished, gone. The air got heavy, thick, pressing down with the weight of a coming grave. Thomas dug his heels into his mare, Belle, trying to push her toward the cattle. But the blizzard wasn't coming. It was already there. It hit like a solid wall of ice and fury. Snow didn't fall. It flew sideways, like bullets made of cold. In seconds, his beard was a block of ice. He couldn't see his own horse's ears. The ranch house, his only shelter, was 3 miles away. It might as well have been on the moon. He dropped the reins, giving Belle her head, and sent a silent prayer into the white chaos. A horse knows the way home when a man is already lost. The cold was a physical thing, a blade sliding between his ribs. Just as he was sure his heart was about to freeze solid, a smudge of orange paint appeared in the white wall. A tiny, impossible flicker. Firelight. Belle stopped, her hooves stamping near a dark shape huddled against a rocky outcrop. It was a low cone, almost completely swallowed by the driving snow. A teepee. Every warning his father had ever given him about Indians screamed in his head. Vicious, savage, killers. But another voice, colder and more honest, cut through the noise. The cold doesn't care who you are. The cold just kills. He practically fell out of the saddle, his legs numb stumps. He stumbled to the teepee, knocked a frozen fist against a support pole, and tried to make his jaw work. Caught in the storm, he managed to crack out, the words turning to ice on his lips. For a long moment, nothing. Then the hide flap was pulled aside, and that's when his world tilted on its axis. Dark eyes met his. A young woman, maybe 20, stood in the opening. Behind her, another woman, a little older, rose from beside the fire. The firelight caught the intricate beadwork on their soft deerskin dresses. The air was still. The only sound was the howl of the wind trying to get in. The younger one spoke first, her English careful and clear. Come, bring horse. They worked without wasted motion, tying Belle on the sheltered side of the outcrop before pulling Thomas into the circle of warmth. The sudden change was like a punch to the chest. A small, clean fire glowed in the center, smoke curling up through an opening at the peak. Buffalo robes were laid out around the flames. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else. Herbs, and something metallic. Thomas stood there dripping, shaking, completely unsure of what to do. The younger woman pointed to a spot by the fire. Sit, she said, her voice soft but firm, or you fall. He sat. His legs wouldn't have held him another second. The older sister watched him, her gaze steady, unreadable. She spoke to the younger one in their own tongue, the words quick and low like the sound of a running stream. He felt like a bug under a glass. Then the older one did something that surprised him. She moved. Not toward him, but to the far side of the teepee, where a bundle of furs was piled. She knelt and gently adjusted the furs. From the bundle came a low moan of pain. There was someone else in here, someone hurt. The younger woman seemed to notice his gaze. I am Mary, she said, her voice a little strained. This is my sister, Sarah. He tried to introduce himself. Thomas Garrett. My ranch is 3 miles south, I think. Sarah ignored him. She came back to the fire and handed him a clay cup filled with a dark, steaming liquid. The tea was bitter, strong, tasting of the forest floor. It burned a path down his throat, then spread a fiery warmth through his chest all the way to his fingertips. The pain of life returning was sharp and fierce. Pain means no frostbite, Sarah said, her voice quiet but carrying an authority he wouldn't dare question. Drink more. They took his frozen coat, hanging it near the fire to dry, and wrapped him in a thick blanket. They moved with a calm efficiency that spoke of 1,000 storms weathered, 1,000 crises met. All the stories he'd ever heard about Apache cruelty, about scalps and raids. They all felt like lies in this small, quiet circle of warmth. "Why are you helping me?" The question tumbled out of his mouth before he could stop it, and shame burned his face. Mary looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something other than caution in her eyes. "The storm does not care if a man is white or Apache," she said simply. "The cold kills all the same." The wind hammered against the hide walls, but inside there was a strange, deep stillness. He found himself talking, telling them about his herd, about the suddenness of the storm. They listened, asking sharp, intelligent questions. They knew the land, the weather, better than any rancher he knew in town. He couldn't help himself. He looked again toward the bundle of furs. The smell of blood was faint, but it was there, underneath the herbs and smoke. "Are you alone out here?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah's face went hard. The warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by something cold and sharp as flint. "Our men were taken to the reservation," she said, her words clipped. "We chose a different path." He knew what that meant. They were fugitives, breaking the law, hiding. His father would have turned them in without a second thought, but his father's laws hadn't saved him from the blizzard. These women had. Something inside him, a wall he hadn't even known was there, began to crack. Hours melted away. He kept talking, the words spilling out of him like he was a man dying of thirst who just found water. He told them how he kept to himself, how he hadn't locked his heart by choice, but because fever had taken his parents and taught him that quiet hurt less than loss. Mary listened, her expression open and kind. Sarah just poured more tea, her silence as powerful as any words. "You have no woman," Sarah stated. It wasn't a question. "No children." "No," he admitted, the heat from the fire suddenly feeling much hotter on his face. Mary studied him. "A young man with land and cattle. The white women must want you for a husband." The truth came out of him, raw and unexpected. "I don't know how to want back." For the first time, a tiny ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "You learn." Just then, the person in the furs moaned again, louder this time, a spasm of pain. Sarah was at their side in an instant, her hands moving with practiced skill, murmuring low, soothing words in Apache. Thomas saw it then, a dark stain spreading on the furs near the person's leg. It was a blood stain, and it was fresh. They weren't just hiding from the reservation. They were hiding from something else, something that had happened very, very recently. The wind outside began to die down, its shriek fading to a low moan. Wrapped in the buffalo robe, listening to the soft murmur of their language, he drifted into an exhausted sleep. But his last waking thought wasn't of the storm, it was of the blood, and the quiet, desperate fear he now saw hiding behind Mary's kind eyes. Morning came with a pale gray light filtering through the smoke hole. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world wrapped in a blanket of silent, pristine snow. The fire was down to glowing embers. Thomas sat up, his body stiff but alive. He was alive. Mary was sitting near the entrance, her hands busy with a piece of intricate beadwork, colored threads pooling in her lap. Sarah was gone. "The storm has passed," Mary said when she saw he was awake. "Your horse is well." "I should check my cattle," he said, his voice hoarse. "Eat first." She handed him a wooden bowl of a thick, savory stew that smelled of sage and wild onion. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. As he ate, he found himself telling her about his parents, about the lonely years spent building his ranch into something that felt like a fortress against the world. She listened, and then she told him a little of her own story. Her father killed at Sand Creek. Her mother wasted away by grief after the soldiers came. Her words were simple, delivered without self-pity, and they cut deeper than any blade. They weren't just stories. They were the bones of her life. Just then, the hide flap lifted and Sarah stepped inside, carrying an armful of firewood, her dark hair dusted with snow. She said something to Mary in Apache, then glanced at Thomas and gave him a curt nod. "She says you look less like a frozen rabbit this morning," Mary translated, a small smile playing on her lips. "More like a nervous deer," Thomas found himself replying. A laugh, rusty and unused, escaped his chest. It felt foreign, but good. He followed them outside into a world reborn in white. The teepee was nestled perfectly in a rock shelter, positioned to catch the least amount of wind. A small spring, protected by an overhang, ran nearby under a thin sheet of ice. This wasn't luck. This was skill. This was survival. Apache women build the homes, Sarah said, a fierce pride in her voice. Men hunt. Men fight. Women make life possible. They showed him their hidden caches of food, their stores of herbs. He was looking at a life built with knowledge he could barely comprehend. But his eyes kept drifting to the ground. He was looking for tracks, for any sign of who else had been there. That's when he saw them, small, dark shapes moving against the endless white of the plains. Riders, 3 of them, pushing their horses through the deep drifts, coming straight for the teepee. In an instant, the peace shattered. Sarah went rigid, her body becoming a statue of defiance. Mary's hand, the one not holding her beadwork, moved instinctively to the knife at her belt. Thomas felt his blood run cold. He recognized the lead rider's coat. Jim Henderson, he breathed, his neighbor, a man known for being fair, but also for being a staunch believer in the law. "Go inside," Sarah commanded, her voice a low hiss. "We will speak to them." "No," Thomas said, surprising himself. He stepped forward, planting his feet in the snow between the teepee and the approaching riders. "They know me. They won't be so quick to start trouble if I'm standing here." The men drew closer. Jim Henderson raised a gloved hand. "Garrett, we thought you were a goner for sure. Saw your cattle scattered to hell and back." "Found shelter," Thomas called back, his voice tight. He was acutely aware of the 2 women standing silently behind him, a living, breathing secret that could get them all killed. But it wasn't Jim's eyes that worried him. It was the other 2 men, Pete, Jim's younger brother, and a ranch hand named Dobbs. Pete's eyes narrowed as he stared past Thomas at Mary and Sarah. Dobbs spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the pure white snow. "Well, look what we have here," Dobbs sneered. "A couple of reservation runaways." "The storm didn't ask to see papers," Thomas said, his voice level, cold. "Neither did their kindness." Jim Henderson was a smart man. He took in the scene. The strategically placed teepee, Thomas standing like a guard dog, the 2 silent women behind him. He weighed the biting cold, the miles back to his own ranch, and the look in Thomas Garrett's eyes. "I don't see anything out here but a whole lot of snow," Jim said finally, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Boys, you see anything different?" Pete looked like he wanted to argue. His eyes were still fixed on Mary, a greedy, unpleasant light in them. But Jim's glare was harder than any winter wind. He shut his mouth. The 3 men turned their horses and began riding away, back toward the southern pastures. But just before they disappeared over a ridge, Pete Henderson did something that made the hair on Thomas's neck stand up. He paused, pretending to adjust his saddle. And as he did, his gaze dropped to the ground, right where Thomas had been standing. His eyes widened, just for a second. Thomas looked down. There, half melted into the snow from the warmth of the teepee's entrance, was a single, perfect, dark red drop of blood. Pete had seen it. He turned and rode away. But Thomas knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the blizzard ever could, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When the riders were gone, a tremor went through Thomas he couldn't control. It wasn't fear. It wasn't cold. It was the feeling of a choice being made. He had drawn a line in the snow, and he had chosen to stand on the side of these 2 women. "Why risk yourself for us?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet, the suspicion back in her eyes. He looked from her to Mary, whose gaze was filled with a cautious, fragile hope. "Because you trusted me first," he said. The words were simple, and they were the truest things he had ever said. Inside, the fire seemed warmer. The small space felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. He knew he should leave, find his cattle, get back to his own life. But he also knew that the man who had ridden out into that storm was gone forever. Something inside him had thawed, and once ice breaks, a river can never go back to being stone. He stayed for 2 more days, helping them secure the teepee and gather more wood. He learned more in those 2 days than he had in 10 years on his own. Sarah taught him which bark could be brewed into a painkiller, and Mary showed him how to track a snow hare by the faintest disturbance in the drifts. They worked together, a strange and silent rhythm developing between them. But the peace was fragile. Every shadow on the horizon looked like a rider. Every snap of a frozen branch sounded like a rifle cocking. On the third morning, he knew he had to go back. "They'll be looking for you," Mary said, her hands busy packing a small bundle of food for him. "Your friends." "They're not my friends," Thomas said, the words tasting like ash. "Not if they're hunting you." Sarah was standing by the entrance, staring out at the plains. "They are not hunting us," she said, her voice grim. "They are hunting what we took." Thomas froze. "What you took?" Mary stopped packing the food. She looked at her sister, a silent question passing between them. Sarah gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Mary turned back to Thomas, her eyes dark with a story he was only just beginning to understand. "There was a boy at the reservation," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He was sick with the lung fever. The agent, Mr. Pendleton, he had medicine. Good medicine from the East. But he wouldn't give it to the boy. He said it was for the soldiers only." Sarah took over, her voice sharp with anger. "The boy's mother begged. We all begged." Pendleton laughed. He said an Indian boy's life wasn't worth the cost of the powder. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "So we took it," Mary said, her chin high. "In the night, a box of medicine. Enough to save the boy and maybe others. We were running, trying to get away, when the ranch hands saw us. They didn't ask questions. They just started shooting." She looked down at her own leg. "Pete Henderson's bullet grazed me. It is not deep, but it was enough to make us slow. It all clicked into place. The blood, the runaways. The way Pete had stared at them. They weren't just fugitives from the government. They were thieves in the eyes of his neighbors. And he had just lied to protect them. "The medicine," he said, his mind racing. "Where is it?" Sarah pointed to the bundle of furs in the corner. "It is not a person," she said. "It is a box." He felt like a fool. He had been so sure someone was hurt, and he was right, just not in the way he thought. They had risked everything, not for themselves, but for a sick child. "You have to get out of here," he said, the urgency sharp in his voice. "When they find my cattle, they'll come back. They'll search everywhere." "We cannot travel fast," Mary said, touching her leg, "and we cannot leave the medicine." A plan, desperate and half-formed, started to bloom in Thomas's mind. It was insane. It was dangerous. It would make him an outlaw, an enemy to every white man in the territory. "You're not leaving it," he said, his voice steady with a conviction he didn't know he possessed. "You're bringing it to my ranch." Sarah stared at him, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You would hide us? In your own home?" "They won't look for you there," he argued. "It's the last place they would think. They think I'm one of them." He paused. "They're wrong." It was a gamble that could cost him everything. His land, his freedom, his life. But as he looked at Mary, at the quiet strength in her face, and at Sarah, at the fierce protective fire in her eyes, he knew he had no other choice. His fortress on the prairie had been built to keep the world out. Now he was about to invite the most dangerous part of it right through his front door. The journey to his ranch was a nightmare of slow, agonizing tension. They moved under the cover of a low gray sky, sticking to creek beds and low ground, trying to leave as little sign as possible. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a rifle. Sarah, despite her stoicism, was clearly watching their back trail, her hand never far from her knife. Mary, favoring her wounded leg, rode Belle, while Thomas led the way on foot, carrying the precious, heavy box of medicine. His small, sturdy ranch house had never looked so welcoming. It was a haven, a fortress. But as he ushered them inside, he knew he had just turned it into a target. "They will see the smoke from your chimney," Sarah said, scanning the empty horizon from his single window. "I always have a fire going in the winter," Thomas said. "It's normal. The best way to hide is to act like there's nothing to hide." He helped Mary onto the simple cot in the corner, his hands brushing against hers. A jolt like lightning passed between them. He pulled back quickly, his face burning. He was a man who hadn't touched another person with any tenderness in 5 years. The feeling was terrifying and wonderful. Sarah began to inspect the small cabin, her eyes missing nothing. She was like a wolf testing the strength of a cage. She pointed to his stores of flour and salted pork. This is not enough for 3 people through the winter. I'll go to town, he said. Get more supplies. They will be watching you, she countered. They will ask questions. Why does a man who lives alone suddenly need 3 times the food? She was right. Every move he made from now on would be under a microscope. He felt the walls of his own life closing in on him. He had brought them here to protect them, but he might have just led them into a more sophisticated trap. That night an idea came to him. It was a lie, a big one, but it was the only thing he could think of. The next morning he rode into the small, dusty town of Cedar Falls. He tied Belle outside the general store and walked in, forcing himself to look relaxed. The store was empty except for the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, Jim and Pete's father. Thomas, the old man greeted him, heard you had a close call with that blizzard. My boys were worried. Got lucky, Thomas said, grabbing a sack of flour. Found a sheltered canyon. He started piling supplies on the counter. Extra sacks of beans, flour, sugar, coffee, a side of bacon. More than he'd ever bought at once in his life. Henderson raised an eyebrow. Expecting company? Here it was, the moment it would all fall apart or hold together. My cousin is coming, Thomas said, the lie feeling clumsy in his mouth. From back east, his wife and him. They lost their farm, coming to stay with me for the winter, maybe longer. Henderson's eyes searched his face. Thomas held his breath. For a man who lived alone, announcing the arrival of family was a huge change. It was a plausible story, but it was thin. Well, that's good news, Henderson said finally, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. It's not good for a man to be alone out here. Relief washed over Thomas so intensely his knees felt weak. He paid for the supplies, loaded them onto his pack mule, and was just about to leave when the door swung open. Pete Henderson walked in. His eyes landed on Thomas, then on the overloaded pack mule outside. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. Well, well, Garrett. Stocking up? My cousins are coming to stay, Thomas said, keeping his voice flat. Pete's smile widened. He walked right up to Thomas, close enough that Thomas could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. Cousins, huh? He said, his voice low and mocking. That's funny. I could have sworn I saw you playing host to a couple of pretty little Apache squaws the other day. The air in the store went cold. Old man Henderson stopped counting his money. You must have been seeing things in the snow, Thomas said, his hand balling into a fist at his side. Oh, I saw something, Pete hissed, his eyes glittering with malice. I saw a thief and a liar who helps him. There's a bounty on those two, you know. A government bounty. For the medicine they stole. This was a new twist. A bounty. Now it wasn't just about suspicion. It was about money. Every desperate man in the territory would be looking for them. You've got a dirty mouth, Pete, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Pete laughed. And you've got a soft spot for runaways. We'll see how long that lasts when Agent Pendleton gets here. He's on his way, and he ain't as friendly as my brother. He shoved past Thomas and went to the counter. Thomas stood there for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. Agent Pendleton, a government man. This was escalating far beyond a local dispute. He had to get back to the ranch. He had to warn them. As he untied Belle's reins, he saw Pete watching him from the store's window, that same ugly smile on his face. This wasn't just about a bounty. This was personal. Pete wanted to see him fall, and he was going to use Mary and Sarah to do it. He rode like a man possessed, the pack mule struggling to keep up. When he burst into the cabin, the look on his face was enough to make both women reach for their knives. He told them everything. The bounty, Pete's accusations, the coming of Agent Pendleton. Sarah's face was a mask of grim resolve. We must leave, she said. Tonight. We have brought this trouble to your door. No, Thomas said, slamming his hand on the rough wooden table. You run. You prove him right. He'll hunt you down. Pendleton will hunt you down. Running is what they expect. Then what do we do? Mary asked, her voice trembling slightly. We cannot fight a government agent. No, Thomas agreed. We can't. But maybe we don't have to. He looked around the small cabin, at the new supplies piled against the wall. He thought of the lie he had told. We do the opposite of running. We hide you in plain sight. Sarah stared at him as if he were insane. What are you talking about? I told them my cousins were coming, he said, the plan solidifying in his mind even as he spoke. A man and his wife. From the east. He looked at Mary, then at Sarah. They're not looking for two Apache women hiding in a cabin. They're looking for fugitives on the run. He started pacing, the energy of the desperate idea filling the small room. We change how you look. We cut your hair. We get you different clothes. When people come by, you're not Mary and Sarah, the Apache sisters. You're Mrs. and Mr. Smith, my quiet, shy cousins who lost their farm and speak very little English. He looked at Sarah. You'd have to pretend to be a man. Sarah's eyes flashed with indignation. You want me to cut my hair? To dress as a man? I want you to stay alive, he shot back. It's crazy, I know, but it's so crazy, it might just work. No one would ever think to look for you right here, living a normal life. Mary was looking at him, a strange expression on her face. It was a mix of fear and something else. Admiration. He is right, sister, she said softly. The safest place is the one they would never imagine. Sarah was silent for a long time, her pride warring with her pragmatism. She looked at the single window toward the vast open land that was no longer a refuge, but a hunting ground. Finally, she picked up her knife, but she didn't point it at Thomas. She walked over to her sister, and with a few deft, heartbreaking slices, she began to cut Mary's long, beautiful black hair. The hair that was a symbol of her identity, of her connection to her people. Thomas watched, his heart aching. He had asked them not just to hide, but to erase themselves. The first snip of the scissors was the sound of a gamble being made. A gamble for their lives, played with their very souls as the stake. The transformation was shocking. With their hair cut short and dressed in his own spare trousers and shirts, they looked like strangers. Mary, with her delicate features, looked like a young, frightened boy. Sarah, with her sharp cheekbones and fierce eyes, looked like a hard-bitten man who had seen too much of the world. The change was so complete, it was terrifying. They had vanished. Living the lie was the hardest thing Thomas had ever done. Days were spent in a state of constant, humming tension. He worked his land, tended his cattle, trying to maintain the fiction of his boring, solitary life. Inside the cabin, the two sisters lived like ghosts, speaking in whispers, never going near the window during the day. The evenings were the strangest part. They would sit around the fire, the three of them, a bizarre parody of a family. Thomas found himself teaching Mary to read and write English, using his mother's old Bible. She was a quick study, her mind sharp and thirsty for knowledge. He learned that her quietness wasn't shyness, but a deep, observant intelligence. He started to see the woman, not the fugitive. Sarah was a harder wall to crack. She watched him constantly, her suspicion a tangible presence in the room. But slowly she began to share her own knowledge. She taught him how to read the signs of a coming sickness in his cattle, how to use wild herbs to make a poultice that drew the infection from a nasty cut on his hand. She was a healer, a protector. He began to see the warrior, not just the runaway. One afternoon, a rider approached. It was Jim Henderson. Panic seized Thomas. He motioned for them to go to the small loft, a dark space under the eaves he had built for storage. They scrambled up the ladder and pulled it up behind them, vanishing into the shadows. Thomas opened the door, forcing a calm he did not feel. "Jim," he said. "Thomas," Jim greeted him, his face troubled. "Just wanted to check on you. My brother, he's been running his mouth in town. About you." "Pete's always been a fool," Thomas said, leaning against the doorframe, trying to block the view inside. "Maybe," Jim said, his eyes scanning the area. "But he's got people listening. He's forming a posse. Says he's going to hunt down those Apache and collect the bounty himself. And he's telling everyone you're helping them." The threat was no longer distant. It was here, being organized by his own neighbor. "He's wrong," Thomas lied, the word tasting sour. Jim sighed, his gaze landing on the ground by the cabin door. "I hope so, Thomas. For your sake. Because Agent Pendleton arrived this morning, and he's not a man who listens to reason. He's offering triple the bounty for any information leading to their capture." Triple the bounty. Enough money to make a man betray his own brother. He wants to make an example of them, Jim continued, his voice low. And anyone who helps them. He looked Thomas straight in the eye. Be careful. He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Thomas with a heart full of ice. He called up to the loft. It's clear. Mary and Sarah came down, their faces pale in the dim light. They had heard everything. A posse, Mary whispered, her eyes wide with fear. They will search everywhere. They will come here, Sarah said, her voice flat. It is only a matter of time. That night, no one slept. The silence of the prairie felt different, filled with menace. Every creak of the cabin walls was the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Thomas sat in a chair by the door, his father's old shotgun across his lap. He had never been a violent man, but he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if Pete Henderson kicked in his door, he would shoot. Just before dawn, Sarah came to sit by the fire. She sharpened her knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the quiet room. This plan of yours, she said without looking at him. This hiding. It is the trick of the rabbit, not the wolf. We cannot stay here and wait for the trap to close. What else can we do? He asked, his voice weary. The whole territory is hunting you. You said they are hunting for 2 Apache women, she said, a new dangerous light in her eyes. Let's give them something to find. Thomas didn't understand. What do you mean? We leave a trail, she said, standing up, a false trail, one that leads them far away from here, far to the north, toward the mountains. They'll follow it, Thomas said, and when they find nothing at the end, they'll know they were tricked. They'll come right back here. They will not find nothing, Sarah said, and a slow, cold smile touched her lips. They will find a grave. The plan was audacious, morbid, and brilliant. They would use the next snowfall to their advantage. Sarah, wearing her own moccasins, would lead a single horse north, making a clear trail. Mary, wearing Thomas's oversized boots, would stay with him. Sarah would travel for 2 days, then double back, walking in a frozen creek bed where she would leave no tracks, making it seem as if she had simply vanished into the unforgiving mountains. But the final piece was the most chilling. Before she left, they spent a day digging in the frozen ground near a riverbank miles from the ranch. They dug a shallow, makeshift grave. Into it, they placed a few of Mary's old beads, a strip of leather from her dress, and a lock of the black hair they had been forced to cut. They made it look like a hasty burial, a place where one fugitive had laid another to rest before disappearing forever. The posse would find the trail. They would follow it. They would find the grave. They would assume one of the sisters had died from her wound or the cold, and the other had fled into the mountains, never to be seen again. The hunt would be called off. The bounty would go unclaimed. It was a chance, a slim, desperate chance. The night before she was due to leave, the first flakes of a new snow began to fall. It was a sign. Sarah stood by the door, dressed for the journey, a small pack on her back. She turned to her sister. They spoke in Apache, their hands clasping. It was a goodbye that might be forever. Then Sarah looked at Thomas. You are a strange man, Thomas Garrett, she said. You risk your life for people you do not know. I know you, he said simply. She gave a short, sharp nod, and then she was gone, a ghost disappearing into the swirling white. For 2 days, Thomas and Mary waited. The silence in the cabin was a heavy, suffocating thing. The space Sarah had occupied felt like a gaping wound. Mary was quiet, her hands never still, constantly mending clothes or cleaning, as if trying to keep her fear at bay with simple tasks. On the 3rd day, the posse came. Thomas saw them from the window, a line of 12 riders, with Pete Henderson and a stern-faced man in a suit at the lead, Agent Pendleton. Upstairs, Thomas hissed. Mary scrambled for the loft. He opened the door before they could knock, the shotgun held casually in the crook of his arm. Garrett, Pendleton said, his voice as thin and sharp as a razor, we're looking for 2 fugitive Indians. My sources tell me they came this way. He stared pointedly at Thomas. Lots of folks came this way during the blizzard, Thomas said, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Can't keep track. Pete pushed his horse forward. Search the cabin. Pendleton nodded. 2 of the men dismounted and pushed past Thomas. He held his ground, knowing that any resistance would be an admission of guilt. He could hear them overhead, stomping around the small loft. He prayed Mary was hidden well enough that she wouldn't make a sound. The men came back down. "Nothing, sir. Just some old junk." Pendleton's eyes narrowed, scanning every inch of the cabin from the doorway. His gaze fell on the fireplace, where 2 tin cups sat on the mantel. Thomas always used the same one. "You've been entertaining, Garrett?" Pendleton asked, his voice silky smooth. "My cousin arrived," Thomas said, repeating his lie. "He's out checking the fence line." Pendleton smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "Of course he is." He turned his horse. "The trail we found leads north. We'll follow it. But make no mistake, Garrett. If I find out you've been lying to a federal agent, I will burn this ranch to the ground with you inside it." The posse rode off, following the tracks Sarah had so carefully laid. Thomas leaned against the door, his body shaking with the aftermath of the adrenaline. It wasn't over. Pendleton didn't believe him. He had just bought them a little time, that was all. Mary came down from the loft, her face ashen. "He knows," she whispered. "He suspects," Thomas corrected her, though he didn't believe it himself. "Sarah's trail has to work. It has to." 4 days later, Jim Henderson rode up to the cabin alone. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped. "They found it," he said without preamble. "A grave up by the Gray River. Looked like one of them didn't make it. The trail of the other one just disappeared into the mountains. Pendleton thinks she froze to death up there." He looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and relief. "The hunt is off. Pendleton is heading back to the reservation. It's over, Thomas." It was over. The lie had worked. The impossible, desperate gamble had paid off. That night, for the first time in weeks, Thomas and Mary ate their meal without the constant weight of fear pressing down on them. A fragile sense of peace settled over the small cabin. But as the days turned into a week, then 2, a new tension began to grow. Sarah had not returned. Every morning, Thomas would climb the ridge and scan the horizon, looking for a sign of her. Every evening he came back and shook his head at Mary's unspoken question. The mountains were harsh. 1,000 things could have gone wrong. A slip on an icy rock, a sudden storm, a chance encounter with a bear. Or worse, a bounty hunter who hadn't given up the search. The relief they had felt began to curdle back into fear, this time mixed with a heavy dose of grief. Mary grew quieter, her eyes holding a permanent shadow of worry. The cabin, which had started to feel like a home, now felt like a prison for 2. Thomas found himself watching her, his heart aching for her pain. He saw the way her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. He heard the small, choked sobs she tried to hide in the dead of night. One evening, he couldn't stand it anymore. He sat down across from her at the small table. "We can't give up hope," he said softly. She looked up, and the raw grief in her eyes was like a physical blow. "She is all I had," she whispered. "My whole life it has been her, protecting me. Now she is gone because of me, because we took that medicine." "You did that to save a child," he said. "That was bravery, not a crime." Tears streamed down her face. "What good is bravery if you end up alone?" He didn't know what to do. He was a man of fences and solitude. Comfort was a foreign language to him. But instinct took over. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was soft, her fingers cold. He just held it, offering the only thing he had, a silent promise that she was not alone. Not anymore. She didn't pull away. She gripped his hand like a drowning woman clinging to a log. They sat like that for a long time as the fire burned down to embers. 2 lonely people finding a fragile anchor in the vast, empty prairie. Something had shifted between them. The line between protector and protected, between strangers thrown together by fate, had blurred and disappeared. It was 3 weeks to the day after Sarah had left that he saw it. He was on the ridge, doing his morning ritual of scanning the horizon, expecting nothing but the same empty landscape. But there, far to the west, was a tiny column of smoke rising into the crisp winter air. It wasn't a chimney, it was a signal fire, and it was in a pattern he recognized. Sarah had taught it to him. 3 quick puffs, a pause, 3 more. It was the Apache signal for "All is safe, I am here." He ran back to the cabin, shouting her name before he was even through the door. "Mary, it's Sarah. She's back." The joy on Mary's face was like the sun breaking through a month of clouds. Together they rode out, following the direction of the smoke. They found her in a small hidden box canyon, tending a small fire. She was thinner, leaner, her face weathered by the wind, but her eyes were bright and alive. The sisters embraced, a flood of Apache words pouring between them, a mixture of relief and recriminations and love. When they finally broke apart, Sarah looked at Thomas. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. "I saw this in a tree," she said. "It reminded me of the birds that returned to your field after the storm." It was the closest she would ever come to saying thank you. But Thomas understood. The return of Sarah brought a new sense of balance to the cabin. The three of them were a unit now, forged by crisis and deception. They settled into a routine, a strange and secret family. Thomas worked the ranch, Sarah hunted, providing them with fresh meat, and Mary turned the small cabin into a home, her quiet presence filling it with a warmth it had never known. But the outside world wasn't gone forever. One day in early spring, a circuit judge and a U.S. Marshal rode into Cedar Falls. They were there to officially record land claims and settle disputes. It was a normal bureaucratic event, but for Thomas it was a new and terrifying threat. His lie about his cousins was just a story told to the town. It had no legal standing. If anyone started asking official questions, the whole deception could unravel. Agent Pendleton might be gone, but the law was still the law. Mary and Sarah were still, technically, fugitives and property of the U.S. government. He needed a way to make the lie real, to protect them not just with a gun and a story, but with the power of the law itself. And there was only one way to do that. That night, he asked Mary to marry him. He did it awkwardly, stumbling over the words as they sat by the fire. He told her it was a practical solution. A marriage recorded by the circuit judge would make her legally his wife, Mrs. Mary Garrett. It would give her a new name, a legal identity. It would be a shield no one could question. He didn't speak of his feelings. He didn't speak of the way his heart hammered in his chest whenever she smiled at him. He presented it as a business arrangement, a strategy for survival. She listened silently, her face unreadable in the flickering firelight. Sarah watched from the shadows, her expression grim. When he was finished, Mary was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You would tie yourself to me? A woman with a bounty on her head? A woman who can bring you nothing but danger?" "You've already brought me more than you know," he said, and the truth of the word surprised him. She had brought life back into his empty house. She had broken down the fences around his heart. She looked at Sarah, who gave a slow, solemn nod. "I will be your wife, Thomas Garrett," Mary said, her voice soft but clear. The wedding was the strangest ceremony in the history of Wyoming. Thomas and Mary rode into town, leaving Sarah hidden back at the ranch. Mary wore a simple dress she had sewn from a bolt of calico, her short hair hidden under a bonnet. Thomas stood beside her in front of the stern-faced circuit judge, his hands sweating as he held hers. The judge mumbled the words, signed the paper, and declared them man and wife. Legally, officially, it was done. As they rode back to the ranch with the marriage certificate tucked safely in his coat pocket, a thought struck Thomas. He had married her to protect her, but in tying her to him, he had also given Pete Henderson and men like him a new weapon. Before, they could only accuse him of helping fugitives. Now he had legally married one. He hadn't ended the danger. He had just wrapped it around himself like a second skin, and he had no idea that Agent Pendleton, disgraced but not defeated, had found a new, even more terrifying piece of leverage to use against them. He had found the one person whose testimony could destroy their entire world, the mother of the child they had saved. The peace that followed the wedding was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river. They lived as a family. Thomas and Mary, in the eyes of the law and in their own hearts, were husband and wife. A quiet, unspoken affection grew between them, born of shared danger and mutual respect. Sarah remained their guardian, a silent wolf patrolling the edges of their small, secret world. But the threat hadn't vanished. It had just gone quiet. One day, Jim Henderson rode out to the ranch, his face graver than Thomas had ever seen it. "Pendleton is back," he said, his voice low. He's not a government agent anymore. He was dismissed after the official report said the fugitives were dead. But he's not letting it go. He's a private citizen now, but he's got money and he's got influence. What does he want? Thomas asked, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He's contesting your marriage, Jim said. He's filed a petition with the territorial court. He claims you married a known fugitive under false pretenses. He claims Mary is still government property and that your marriage is fraudulent. The legal shield Thomas had built was about to be shattered. But that's not the worst of it, Jim continued, his eyes full of pity. He's found a witness. He went back to the reservation and found the woman whose son you saved. Her name is Tala. Mary, who had come to the doorway, let out a small, strangled gasp. Pendleton is twisting the story, Jim explained. He's telling the court that Mary and Sarah didn't save the boy. He's saying they stole the medicine to sell it and that the boy died anyway because they didn't know how to use it. He's painting them as murderers. It was a lie so monstrous, so evil, that Thomas could barely comprehend it. And Tala, Mary whispered, she is his witness? Pendleton has her under his control, Jim said grimly. He's promised her food, protection, things she can't get otherwise. He's forcing her to testify against you. The hearing is in 3 weeks. Their world collapsed. Pendleton hadn't just come back with accusations. He'd come back with a story that turned their act of heroism into a crime. And he was using the very person they had helped as the instrument of their destruction. If the court ruled against them, the marriage would be annulled. Mary and Sarah would be arrested, not as fugitives, but as thieves and murderers. Thomas would be charged with harboring criminals and fraud. They would lose everything. The next few weeks were a living hell. The community they had so carefully avoided was now their only hope. Thomas, with Jim Henderson's help, began to prepare a defense. They needed people to speak for them, to testify to their character. But who would stand up for a white rancher and his 2 Apache family members against the word of a powerful man like Pendleton? The answer came from the most unexpected places. Miss Whitman, the quiet Quaker schoolteacher in town, came forward. Sarah, in her guise as Thomas's cousin, had once helped her reset a broken bone after she'd been thrown from her buggy, using her knowledge of splints and poultices. Miss Whitman offered to testify about her skill as a healer. The Chen family, Chinese immigrants who ran the town laundry and were often treated as outcasts themselves, also offered their support. Mary had secretly been teaching their young son to read. They would speak of her kindness. Slowly, a small, unlikely coalition of the forgotten and the ignored began to form around them. It wasn't an army, but it was a start. The day of the hearing arrived, gray and cold. The small courthouse was packed. On one side sat Pendleton, flanked by 2 expensive-looking lawyers. On the other side sat Thomas, Mary, and Sarah, with Jim Henderson acting as their counsel. The judge was a hard-faced man who looked like he had seen everything and was impressed by nothing. Pendleton's lawyer laid out their case, painting Mary and Sarah as violent, greedy criminals. He made Thomas out to be a fool, blinded by lust for an Indian woman. The words were poison, dripping into the silent room. Then they called their star witness. Tala was led to the stand. She was a small, thin woman, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at Mary, and a flicker of deep, profound shame crossed her face before she looked away. Pendleton's lawyer began his questioning, his voice gentle and coaxing. Tala, did these 2 women steal medicine from the reservation? Tala hesitated. She looked at Pendleton, who gave her a small, threatening nod. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible. And your son, the lawyer continued, did he receive that medicine? Yes, she said. And what happened to your son after he was given that stolen medicine? The lawyer asked, his voice rising for dramatic effect. Did he get better, or did he die? The whole room held its breath. This was the moment, the lie that would condemn them all. Tala looked down at her hands. A tear rolled down her cheek. She took a deep, shuddering breath. When she looked up, she wasn't looking at the lawyer or the judge. She was looking directly at Mary. He lived, she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. They saved his life. The courtroom erupted. Pendleton jumped to his feet, his face purple with rage. The lawyer was stunned into silence. What are you saying? the judge demanded, banging his gavel. He is 8 years old now, Tala said, the words pouring out of her in a rush of truth. He is strong. He runs and plays. This man, she pointed a trembling finger at Pendleton, he told me to lie. He threatened me. He said he would have my rations cut off, that my son would starve. But I cannot lie. These women, they are not murderers. They are heroes. They saved my son when this man would have let him die. It was over. The lie had collapsed. Pendleton's case was in ruins. But he wasn't finished. In a fit of pure, malevolent rage, he lunged forward, pulling a small Derringer pistol from his coat pocket. If the law won't deal with you, I will. What should... He screamed, pointing the gun straight at Mary. Thomas moved without thinking. He threw himself in front of his wife, ready to take the bullet. But someone else was faster. Sarah, who had been sitting silently through the entire proceeding, moved like a blur. She launched herself not at Pendleton, but at the heavy table in front of them. With a strength Thomas didn't know she possessed, she heaved it over, sending it crashing into Pendleton's legs. He stumbled, the gun firing into the ceiling as he fell. In an instant, the U.S. Marshal was on him, wrestling the pistol away and pinning him to the floor. Silence descended on the courtroom, a thick, stunned silence. The judge stared at the scene, at the sputtering, defeated Pendleton, at Thomas shielding his wife, at Sarah standing over the overturned table, her chest heaving, a fierce, protective fire burning in her eyes. He cleared his throat. In light of this testimony and recent events, he said with a hint of dry understatement, all charges against Thomas Garrett, Mary Garrett, and Sarah, Garrett, are dismissed. The marriage is valid. Mr. Pendleton will be held on charges of perjury and attempted murder. He banged his gavel. This court is adjourned. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, blinking like creatures who had just emerged from a long, dark cave. They were free, truly free. The lies were gone. The threat was gone. A small crowd had gathered outside. Miss Whitman, the Chen family, a few other ranchers who had been swayed by the testimony. They began to clap, a slow, scattered applause that grew into a wave of support. Mary squeezed Thomas's hand, her eyes shining with tears of relief. Sarah stood beside them, not smiling, but with a look of profound, weary satisfaction on her face. They hadn't just won a court case, they had won a community. That evening, back at the ranch, the three of them sat around the fire. The little cabin no longer felt like a prison or a fortress. It felt like home. It is a good name, Sarah said suddenly. Garrett. Thomas and Mary looked at her, surprised. It means brave with a spear, she said, a rare small smile touching her lips. I looked it up in your book. Thomas looked at the two women who had crashed into his life and shattered his solitude. A healer who had become his wife, and a warrior who had become his sister. He had faced down a blizzard, a posse, and a corrupt official. He had lied, cheated, and fought to protect them. He had never held a spear in his life, but for the first time, he felt he understood what the word brave really meant. It didn't mean not being afraid. It meant finding something, someone you were willing to be afraid for. The story of what happened in the Cedar Falls courthouse spread through the territory like a grass fire. The tale of the rancher, his Apache wife, and her warrior sister who stood up to a corrupt official became a local legend. They had faced down the worst of the world and had not only survived, but won. But victory didn't mean the world changed overnight. There were still whispers, still hard looks in town, but now there were also nods of respect. People who had once crossed the street to avoid them now sought out Sarah for her knowledge of herbs when a child had a fever, or asked Mary for help mending a complex piece of equipment, her intricate beadwork skills translating into nimble, precise fingers. Thomas found his neighbors asking his advice on where to shelter their herds in a storm, acknowledging that he had a wisdom about the land they lacked. They were no longer just hiding. They were building. With the threat of Pendleton gone, they expanded the ranch. They bought the adjoining parcel of land, the one with the hidden box canyon where Sarah had made her camp. It became her space, a place where she could be herself, away from the confines of the cabin. She began teaching the Chen boy, and soon other children who didn't fit in at the formal schoolhouse, how to read, not just from books, but from the land itself. One summer afternoon, Thomas stood on the same ridge where he had been caught in the blizzard all those years ago. The world looked different now. Below him was not just a ranch, but a small, thriving community. The main house was bigger now, with an extra room built on. A small schoolhouse stood near the creek, Sarah's students playing outside. And in the garden, Mary was bent over a row of corn, her belly swollen with their first child. He watched her, and a feeling of such profound peace washed over him that it almost brought him to his knees. He had thought survival meant building walls to keep the world out. But these two women had taught him the truth. Real survival, real living, was about taking those walls down, piece by piece, and letting the right people in. The past was never truly gone. It lived in the short hair Mary chose to keep, a reminder of the price of their freedom. It lived in the faint scar on her leg, and in the wary way Sarah still watched the horizon, but it no longer ruled them. Years later, people would travel through that part of Wyoming and speak of a strange and beautiful valley where things were different. A place where a white rancher, an Apache healer, and an Apache warrior had forged a family in a storm and built a community based not on lines on a map, but on the strength of their hearts. They had faced the wildness of the land and the hatred of men, and had answered both with a stubborn, unrelenting kindness. And in doing so, they hadn't just survived. They had bloomed. If you were moved by this story of courage and finding family in the most unexpected places, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the human spirit. And let us know in the comments below, what does the word family truly mean to you?